Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
What makes a great leader? Is it genetic, or can you learn leadership skills? Join Tom Fox and Richard Lummis in this podcast, where they consider leadership from a wide variety of perspectives: academic, behavioral science, history, popular culture, the movies, and much more. You'll learn about specific tactics and strategies that you can bring to your own leadership toolkit. 12 O'Clock High is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. As Richard Lummis, I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how to improve our leadership skills. We believe leadership is a skill which can be improved with study of both good and bad practices. We try to draw interesting examples from many sources, including history, film, fiction, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today we'll be discussing the meteoric rise and sort of fall of Adam Neumann and WeWork. It's part of a mini-series on charismatic founders and the tension between creativity and control that exists in every company, but is particularly exaggerated in the startup world. WeWork is fundamentally a real estate leasing company, but under Neumann's charismatic leadership, it sold itself as being on a mission to elevate the world's consciousness and change the way work is structured. At one point, it operated some 520 locations and had a $47 billion valuation with $2 billion in revenue. In the first half of 2019, it had $1.5 billion in revenue, but it should be noted it also had losses from operations of $1.37 billion. In September of 2019, the Wall Street Journal published an extremely skeptical article as they were preparing their IPO, titled, "How Adam Neumann's Over-the-Top Style Built WeWork. This is not the way everybody behaves." The article detailed instances of self-dealing and misbehavior, as well as a corporate culture that can only be described as weird. After the collapse of the proposed IPO in September, the Japanese firm Softbank stepped in to rescue the company, forcing Neumann out, but paying him almost $1.5 billion in cash to make him go away. Tom, where can we start with this? How did a tequila-swilling, pot-smoking guy whose ambition is to become president of the world get so far?
You know, that's a really interesting question, Richard. We have looked previously at Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos. We've taken a look at Travis Kalanick from Uber, and this look at Adam Neumann. In researching this, I really felt like he was different than the first two. Elizabeth Holmes, although at some point she did make a decision to actively engage in deception, I think originally she thought that they could build something, and they spent money and time and effort to try to build the blood testing machine that she had envisioned. I think Travis Kalanick saw a business need and moved in with a business opportunity to the taxi cab and transportation industries that was a gaping hole. What Adam Neumann brought, and I'm glad you focused on the office leasing, because I think there was a real value there and a real opportunity and a real different way to make money. But some of it morphed into, as you said, to elevate the consciousness of the world by the future president of the world. And so I thought Neumann was really different. And it's not clear to me if he was anything more than just a huckster, selling a very big con that a lot of people bought into. At one point, he was given $1.3 billion. 3.1 billion by Softbank, and just basically said, "Here, go use the money."
Yeah.
And boy, did he! So we saw from him. If I could start back with the business model, because I thought the original business model of taking up lease space in offices that were underperforming, and then basically subleasing the desks out, was a relatively good business model. Because you're taking a lease, cost X dollars, you have so many square feet per lease, and if you can sublease those into smaller plots, it's a business model that's been around a long time. And if you can make the economics in each stage of that work where you're protected, i.e., you have a lease, you have clauses to get out of the lease or terminate the lease under certain conditions. You have those same clauses mirrored with your subtenants. That could be, I think, a viable business model. Where at some point, though, that changed. And that changed into something very different that you detailed. We talk about a man who bought Gulfstream for his company. He had, I think, 5 different homes that we identified in some of the research, including a 30 million plus home in the Hamptons outside of New York. He routinely traveled the world looking for the perfect wave to surf on, while smoking pot, crossing international borders on planes. I shudder to think how the pilots protected themselves from that. The vision he was trying to create, one of the companies he created, let me see if I could find it, was Life Biosciences, and its mission was to create a future where age-related decline is not a fact of life. That's very different than office leasing. But the office leasing part still, I think, resonates. I do an office lease, and I find it to be a very economic, cost-effective, and enjoyable way for me to work, to get out of the house, because I primarily work from home when I'm not traveling, but also to be around other professionals and just having that kind of interpersonal connection, interpersonal contact is a positive experience for me. The place where I have the office lease has many of the other amenities, food, coffee, snacks, presentations on various areas of business, printers. There's no spa, but it's certainly a very functional business place to do business. And so being on the head of that revolution, I think, or if not revolutionary, was certainly evolutionary and positive. Where Neumann really seemed to go off the rails, though, in addition to wanting to be the president of the world, was in corporate governance. And I think if the original IPO had gone through as he had envisioned it, it was truly a disaster waiting to happen. As I recall, he had super voting rights of 10-1. His wife had control over who would be named the next CEO if he became incapacitated or died or stepped down. He was engaging in an extraordinary amount of self-dealing, starting with he owned the leases that were being funded by WeWork,
No.
number one. Number two, he somehow claimed a trademark on the phrase "we."
Yes.
And then he sold that trademark to WeWork for $6 million, I believe.
Yes.
You can't trademark "we." Let me just, as a lawyer, I rarely give out legal advice, but I'm just going to tell you on this one, you can't trademark "we."
That one's for free.
That one's for free. And you can "we" wherever you want. If you're English, I'm sure you're tee-heeing at that one. But the self-dealing is mansions were filled with artwork paid for by WeWork. His wife was in charge of culture around the company to the point where I think she advised on the filing statements for the S1 for the IPOs to make sure it looked appropriate for a WeWork document. And so the corporate governance, the conflicts of interest, and the self-dealing all, I think, pointed to extraordinary problems if the company had gone public. I'm not quite sure this next round of comments is outside kind of the leadership we talk about, but I was also really intrigued, not so much with the market response, because I thought the market response was appropriate, but that the market worked. And the valuation was, I think, $47 million was going to be
Initially, yes.
Yeah, and the market balked at that, and the valuation now is around $16 billion. But that's the way markets work. And we've seen in a prior podcast we talked about the IPO of Uber and what the evaluation was planned to be, what the valuation was when it went public, and the value of the stock now. If you want to take it in a different direction, Saudi Aramco recently announced an IPO, and they had originally wanted a valuation of over $2 trillion.
Right.
And they didn't get that. And they weren't able to place it on either the New York or London stock exchanges. And there were no major non-Saudi companies heading the listings for the company or for the offering. And I see that as a market response. So we rarely talk about the markets working in this podcast. We've seen examples of where perhaps the markets didn't work. But this seems to me to be an example of rationality in the markets correcting for irrationality in corporate governance, self-dealing, and evaluation.
Well, and also in the isolated world of venture capital. I think sometimes that world is so small that they all drink the same Kool-Aid, and I think that's what happened here. I think you're absolutely correct. The business model of WeWork was not revolutionary; it was evolutionary, but it made a lot of sense. I've also leased an office, and it was sort of a dark cubicle-like space, and the WeWork spaces are apparently bright, open. They encourage collaboration. They just, people just like to work there. So, and I think the flexibility of it is key. In fact, I was talking with a guy in commercial real estate, and he said the developer Gerald Hines now includes a couple of floors of flex space in all of his new buildings because tenants don't want to necessarily commit to an entire new floor if they're not sure they're going to want it long term. So instead, they take the portions of these flex floors on a more or less temporary basis. So that's a real threat to the WeWork model, but I think it does show that the market is going in that direction.
Well, that's another point on WeWork that struck me is they moved to enterprise clients. Several large corporations rented space from WeWork, where WeWork came in and managed the property, but they had floors dedicated to these individual enterprises, and that seems to me to also make a lot of sense. I know several multi-million-dollar companies that basically have taken that model on rather than having a long-term fixed lease and are able to have that collaboration, have the status of having a office address in a Class A office building with all the amenities. And WeWork was able to make that model work, most particularly in New York City because of the price of real estate. But I think as corporations are shedding themselves of their real estate portfolios, they may try to move to this model too. And once again, as you, I think, correctly note, it may not be revolutionary, but it's certainly evolutionary. And innovation can happen in an evolutionary manner. And I do credit WeWork for taking these concepts which had been around a long time and actually kind of repackaging and popularizing them and making them cool.
But I do go back to the fact that their losses from operations almost equal their revenue. So to the extent they were making it work, I'm not sure what that means in this context.
Right.
The self-dealing you talked about, I mean, among other things, the wife was not the only relative on the payroll. Apparently nepotism was rife. She also would fire people on the spot if she didn't like their energy.
Can I just say you and I probably would have been 1A and 1B.
I think so. One of the other things that struck me, though, here is the very unusual, among the other unusual behaviors, unlike most founders, Neumann was selling his stock in the early rounds. That's highly unusual. Generally, founders hang on to all the stock they can, especially if they believe in the business. In addition, he was borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars against the stock he retained that was going to be paid off as a result of the IPO. Oddly enough, J.P. Morgan held a number of those loans and was one of the underwriters on the IPO, which I'm not sure if that made it to the S1 or not, but it probably should have.
Yeah, I thought that was a very key indicia of, I don't think I can say that's self-dealing, but I would say concern.
Yeah.
When the owner, the founder does that, the $740 million borrowed against his stock, that's just eye-popping.
Yeah.
I find it difficult to believe one person needs $740 million. Nevertheless, that's what he borrowed. And the private jets, the lifestyle he engaged in, they did things like banned reimbursement of employee expenses where a beef product was consumed at
all
lunch.
meat.
All meat. It just seemed to be inconsistent with standard business practices.
I think that's very, very well understated.
Are there any lessons that we can draw from other than kind of the ones we articulated in terms of when you see some of these red flags around corporate governance? I mean, for me, I think the market did appropriately respond, but I would hope investors, when they see this, recognize that if you put your money into a business like this, you really are going eyes wide open. You're going to have zero control. You're going to have zero ability to influence anything, and you're totally at the mercy of someone who runs it as if it's their backyard enterprise.
Yeah. Well, I think the role of Softbank in this may justify its own podcast, but a lot of these other investors were committing hundreds of millions of dollars within minutes of meeting the guy. Now, apparently, he is that good, and I think huckster's probably the right term, but he is that good that these seasoned investors who are used to doing due diligence and everything were just ready to write a check after spending 5 minutes with the guy.
Let's spend a little bit of time about Softbank, because that's really something I don't think we've seen to this extent. Now, in Uber's case, with Travis Kalanick, we had one early investor, I believe Benchmark Capital, who Bob Gurley?
Yeah, Bill Gurley.
Bill Gurley was seen as a mentor figure to Kalanick. But this seemed to be something different, with Masso's son of Softbank really almost, the articles I read suggested that he saw him as a son, or that sort of relationship. Is that, first of all, that's typically not something we see from venture capitalist investors, but did that perhaps blind Softbank or give Neumann too much leeway?
Well, I think it unquestionably gave him too much leeway, and it is bizarre. And the reasons for Softbank to come in after the failed public offering and prop this up have a lot to do with their own internal problems. This would have represented a catastrophic blow to its vision fund if this had gone to zero. And so instead they threw billions of dollars more at it. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the right decision either. But I don't understand the structure of Softbank. Apparently it's a one-guy shop.
I think maybe no one understands the structure of Softbank, and the investors who pumped money into it may be ruining that day.
Yeah, I think so. But and I think that's an interesting question. And was he also conned? Or he's known for taking very big bets at long odds, and a lot of them have paid off. So.
Well, it's an interesting study. I think we're going to be able to talk about WeWork again at some point, simply as the post-Neumann era has arrived and will continue to go forward.
I think it's going to be fun to watch, and I look forward to somebody making that business model work. For now, this is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox with 12 O'Clock High. Join us again next time.
This is Paris Fox again. We hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox. If you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes and rate the podcast. Thank you for listening.